Hello everyone, and welcome to the Zimmerli Art Museum and to our panel discussion, Traditional Contemporary Perspectives on Native American Art. Thank you especially to Joe Baker and Lou Cornum, whom we are honored to have as our panelists this evening. My name is Raven Manygoats, and I'm a curatorial assistant in the Art of the Americas and worked closely with Jaune Quick-to-See Smith on Indigenous Identities, Here, Now, and Always, which is now on view here at the Zimmerli through December. I'm also a PhD candidate in the history department here at Rutgers, and my dissertation focuses on women's participation in the Red Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we stand on is the ancestral territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to Indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora, past, present, and future, and honor those who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised, including the 3 federally recognized nations in Oklahoma and Wisconsin: the Delaware Tribe of Indians, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We also acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey and the United States as a nation, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. The Zimmerli's operations, exhibitions, and programs are funded in part by Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and income from the Avenir Endowment Fund and the Andrew W. Mellon Endowment Fund, among others. Additional support comes from the New Jersey State Council of the Arts, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the donors, members, and friends of the museum. Special thanks to the Nissan Foundation, which made this particular program possible. So before turning things over to our first speaker, Joe Baker, I'll provide a brief overview of the exhibition, Indigenous Identities, Here, Now, and Always. The exhibition was curated by the renowned artist Jaune Quick-to-See Smith, who was a citizen of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Nation. Sadly, Jaune passed away at the age of 85 a week before the opening of the exhibition. Indigenous Identities is a testament to her legacy as a groundbreaking artist and curator. Throughout her over 60-year career, she had over 100 solo exhibitions, including a 2023 retrospective at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and curated over 30 shows. This exhibition at the Zimmerli is Jaune's largest curatorial endeavor and features over 100 artworks across a range of media, from beadwork and jewelry to video and painting. Indigenous Identities foregrounds the significance of identity in art making through the diverse practices of over 97 artists representing more than 50 distinct Indigenous nations from throughout the United States. The exhibition features works made within the last 50 years by both well-established and emerging artists. And it crosses several generations and examines subjects with historic and continuing relevance to Indigenous communities, including stolen lands, genocide, lost languages, and cultures and invisibility. But ultimately, the exhibition celebrates the breadth of groundbreaking contemporary art made by Native American artists. It is a celebration of Indigenous survivance, resistance, and community. To help guide viewers, the exhibition is divided into 4 themes: that of political, tribal, social, and land. The political section confronts often ignored histories and present forms of settler colonial violence and honors traditions of Indigenous resistance. The tribal section features artworks centered on specific tribal identities that incorporate oral histories, origin stories, food sources, and art practices relevant to specific tribal nations. The social section honors community events and also examines ways in which artists have adapted seemingly all-American stories to reflect their own cultures and points of view. Lastly, the land section honors Indigenous peoples' relationships to their homelands and powerfully reminds viewers that we are all on Native land. It's also important to note that Jaune really wanted to highlight the voices of the artists themselves, so all the label text was written by the artists. And in conjunction with Indigenous Identities, I curated a small show entitled Hope with Humor, which features prints and paintings by Jaune Quick-to-See Smith that are from the Zimmerli's permanent collection. Upstairs, we also have an exhibition on the children's book, My Powerful Hair, which is by Carol Lindstrom and illustrated by Steph Littlebird. And our galleries are open until 8 p.m. tonight, so if you haven't had a chance, I hope you guys will check out all our exciting shows. Now to introduce our panelists. So Joe Baker is an enrolled member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. He's an artist, educator, curator, and culture bearer who has been working in the field of Native arts for the past 30 years.
40.
Oh, 40. Baker is the co-founder and executive director of the Lenape Center in Manhattan and an adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of Social Work in New York. Baker earned an MFA from Harvard University and a BFA from the University of Tulsa. He also completed postgraduate study in the Management Development Program at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. Baker's work is part of the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, among many others in the United States and Canada. He is also featured in Indigenous Identities with one of his beautiful bandolier bags, which can be found in the tribal section of the exhibition. And now Lou Cornum is a Navajo writer and assistant professor of Native American Studies in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. They are a founding editorial member of Pinko, a magazine of gay communism, and their writing can be found in Art in America, The New Inquiry, and Triple Canopy. They also wrote an incredible essay for the Indigenous Identities catalog entitled Indigenous Futurism, Collaboration, and Spatial Intervention. The catalog will be released in May, so I hope you guys will check that out as well. And now I will turn things over to Joe. Thank you.
I'm going to make this make noise. We did a sound check, and they said, "Don't worry about this noise." It sort of wakes people up. So now that you're awake, I'm sharing images of two old Delawares, myself and my dear friend and fellow tribesman, Michael Pace. This photograph was taken recently at the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Art in New York City, where we at Lenape Center created the Welcome to Territory exhibition for the exhibit Making Home. The relevance of this image is that we have each our own histories. For myself, that history is the White Turkey Sarcoxy family. And for Michael Pace, that history is the Anderson Elkhare family. Our families were among the 25 surviving families who arrived in Indian Territory in 1857 from forced removals from our ancestral land here in New York, New Jersey, parts of Delaware, and eastern Pennsylvania. Together, as young boys in the late 1950s, we were in the dance arena. And let me tell you, we're still dancing today. So what I want to give, or what I offer this evening is a quick sketch of sort of the history of the Native American fine arts movement. Because how did we get from this exhibition, how did this happen? It just didn't happen overnight. And it really is the result of the dedication and the contribution of many Native artists and Native museums and non-Native museums who created the opportunities and the foundation for contemporary Native expression that we know today. And oddly enough, that energy of activity really began in Oklahoma, which is where my tribal headquarters are in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. From 1946 to 1979, the Philbrook Indian Annual played a pivotal role in the definition of 20th century Native art. It focused on paintings of various styles, whereas other juried shows really focused on traditional art forms. The jurors, which this is really important, were not white curators or white museum officials. They were Native artists. They were Native artists who were judging their peers. And that had never happened in any museum setting in the country. Oscar Howe, in 1958, criticized the Indian Annual by saying that it was not supporting new, non-traditional painting. So from that point in time on, up until its closure in 1979, Philbrook Art Museum became a platform for contemporary Native expression. The Institute of American Indian Arts, which is another catalyst for contemporary Native art, opened in 1962 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, was the visionary work of Lloyd Kivanu, a Cherokee artist, who really had this idea or this concept that Native art could go beyond what was considered traditional practice. It began as a high school and later became a degree granting institution, which we know of today. Lloyd Kivanu, in the 1950s, opened Kiva Studio in Scottsdale, Arizona. It really was the beginning of contemporary Native fashion because he designed textiles, fashions, handbags, men and women's clothing. It was a raving hit in the Southwest. So the Native fashion that we know of today really had its early beginnings with those expressions of Native modernism that Lloyd Kivanu brought to our eyes. Fred Shoulder and T.C. Cannon and Helen Hardin are examples of Native artists who were coming out of that tradition of the Santa Fe, or the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And they did so much to create a patron space, really began the beginning of the gallerists and the collectors that became patrons of contemporary Native art. But here's one you won't know anything about. And that is Atlatl, which was a Native service organization for Native American arts, active from 1974 to 2000. Was an early Native arts activism organization run by Native artists. Based in Santa Fe and later moving to Phoenix, Arizona, Atlatl's work provides a deeper understanding of how Native artists define themselves and showcases constraints that Native artists are faced with in the light of a Native arts market and cultural tourism. By the 1990s, under the leadership of Carla Roberts and Wendy Weston, Atlatl was examining how gaining agency within the Native art world involves creating different forms of awareness and autonomy. Atlatl influenced the rise of Native control over the production, circulation, and exhibition between artists, institutions, and funding bodies to support the arts. A gathering of artists at Wingspread in Wisconsin in 1993 resulted in a paper that became the foundation for the Ford Foundation mapping project. And that project later evolved into the present-day Native Arts and Cultural Foundation, which provides 2-year awards of $100,000 each to Native artists and curators. So collectively, we have this very rich history of energy that has really fueled the possibility for Native artists today. So I don't want to yammer on with this stuff, but I think it's important that we ground the conversation and our understanding of what we see in a gallery today with a better understanding of how Native arts has evolved and how it's prospered, what its voice is today. Thank you.
That wasn't too bad in terms of aggravating sounds. Can you all hear me all right? Okay, excellent. As you heard, I think you mentioned in my bio that I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. I'm also a millennial, so I will be reading off my phone, and you'll have to bear with me through that. So I just wanted to offer some brief, largely informal remarks, really reflections on my encounters with contemporary Native art, and end with some words on the person who made this all possible, Jaune Quick-to-See Smith, who I want to extend gratitude from the beginning for making this exhibit possible, and also thank you to Raven and Brandon and Claire and everybody who's welcomed me here. I was saying to somebody prior to coming up here to speak with you all that it's been a rough week, rough months possibly for many of us. This last week in particular has been pretty tough on the spirit. The intensification of war against Palestinians in Gaza, with the attacks on education broadly, but particularly higher education, where I work, and my concerns about Native American studies, Indigenous studies, our ability to say things like settler colonialism, genocide, invasion, right, I feel are increasingly in peril. And so it was very refreshing to be in this exhibit and walk around and see those kinds of ideas and concepts and the people and the histories and the still ongoing struggles that animate them being voiced and expressed in such a range of forms and media. So it really, nourished me today when I really needed some extra kind of inspiration. And the history also that Joe has provided for us, I think, is really important, as you say, to ground us, right? And everything that made this possible, that it still speaks to, right? That these are unfinished struggles that are referenced in the works, and not just referenced, but sometimes really tied to materially, right, and personally. I'll offer just some remarks about myself, and then some the kind of, I guess concepts and events that have helped me think about, especially contemporary Native art expression. So I was born in Arizona. I was born in the Chandler Regional Hospital to a Dene mother and a white father. And I grew up kind of all over Arizona and never on the reservation of the Navajo Nation, or not even often on the kind of ancestral territory of the Navajo. So I've often described myself as a diasporic Dene, as somebody, right, who exists in this kind of relationship to my homeland, which is not always how indigeneity is understood, particularly in North America, right? But it became a way to kind of understand my ongoing, both political and national identity as a Navajo person who, again, has grown up outside of my homeland. And one of the kind of reasons for that is that my mother was adopted out from her family at a very young age when she was 4 years old, when her mother passed away. And so she was raised by people in California who had pretty low ideas about Native people, Native children, and how to care for them. So that, as you can imagine, was a very traumatic experience for her, her sisters, and for the rest of our family. But she was able to return to New Mexico and live with her Navajo family when she was of age, when she turned 18. And until very recently, when I would go to visit her, one of the 4 sacred mountains of the Navajo was in our view constantly, right? Which is to say that ours is a history marked by separation, relocation, but also return and survivance. But I also, describe myself as diasporic in order to bring the often disparate ideas of indigeneity and movement into closer proximity. Those we consider diasporic are often violently robbed of their indigeneity, and those we consider indigenous are often on the move. That's actually a quote from an essay I wrote a whole decade ago, which kind of blew my mind to realize in returning to it. That essay is called The Space Indians Star Map. And there's a lot that I would obviously write differently 10 years later in that piece, but it's kind of amazing when you return to old writing and you're both like half cringing and half being like, wow, I've really been on about the same thing my whole life, like I'm just kind of circling around these same ideas and finding new ways to approach them. And I do think that essay has some things to speak to the kind of banner under which this event is organized, right? The traditional and the contemporary. And that is kind of a dyad or binary I was trying to think through, similarly along the lines of like diaspora indigeneity, right? Thinking of these kinds of paired words and how they exist sort of either blurred or in a kind of dialectic. And so the Space Indians star map was a way for me to think of diaspora through this figure that I imagined, right, the Space Indian, which was really inspired by a lot of works that were emerging at that time, particularly with Native artists using the kind of images and vocabularies of science fiction to touch on not only Indigenous experience, but the formation of what we call the New World altogether, right? And so much of that kind of history is within like conventional science fiction, and so a lot of Native artists saw that and kind of reappropriated what was often already a kind of appropriation of indigeneity or kind of colonial histories to their own end. And so the Space Indian was kind of my entry into that growing movement of Indigenous futurism that really took off after 2010. And so in Indigenous futurism, I really wanted to make clear a distinction between that kind of, artistic, literary, cultural mode of production and expression from like European futurism. And a lot of that does kind of hinge on the way that the European futurists approach tradition versus how Indigenous futurists and our kind of more immediate relatives, the Afrofuturists, think about tradition. So in that same essay, I write that the Space Indians' disavowal of Western progress makes clear the difference between indigenous futurism and early 20th century forms of futurism, which were compatible with the interests of fascist and oppressive governments, if you know anything about Italian futurism. Unlike those futurists who were in an antagonistic relation with their literary and cultural predecessors, indigenous futurism is centered on bringing traditions to distant future locations rather than abandoning them as relics. So thinking of tradition as something that is always living and changing and applicable to the present circumstances, and perhaps worthy of reinvention and adaptation, recreation, but not worthy of being kind of tossed off into the dustbin of history. Just in the last kind of excerpt from that essay, I wanted to just, I guess, maybe clarify this distinction, or not this distinction, this blurring that I'm making between indigeneity and diasporism, to say that this is not to demean the work of land protectors and defenders who risk serious repercussions for resisting corporate and state encroachment on indigenous territories, right? So there are obviously many indigenous people who still live on their homelands, on their territories, and we are diasporic Native people are as in relationship to them, and should be in ethical ways. The Space Indian supports those who are able and choose to remain on the land, while also hoping to broaden understandings of indigeneity outside simple location. Locations, of course, are never simple. Many of us have experienced, right, our indigeneity stretched across locations. It is the settler who wishes to flatten the relation between place and people by claiming land through ownership. Projecting themselves forward into faraway lands and times, the Space Indian reveals the myriad ways of relating to land beyond property. So although the Space Indian is articulated in this language of science fiction, I was thinking that the Space Indian might be simply an estranged and kind of estranging cousin to the urban Indian. And though I also kind of have an identification with being a suburban Indian, which I think is an under-analyzed demographic, having spent a lot of time in the suburbs of Phoenix and feeling quite alienated there, so there's a lot to go into. I have also lived in New York City since, or been based in New York City since 2007, and so the kind of history of Native New York is very important to me, and so I'm positioning myself in that lineage is also something that has become meaningful to me. And it was because that I was in the city itself, in New York City in particular, that I kind of fell into the life of being a part-time Native art writer, right? Which is, I'd always been an appreciator, a goer to galleries and exhibits, and had some friends who were artists and all that, but hadn't really imagined myself as a critic or somebody with the art historic perspective, but because there was this real just like explosion of activity by Native artists, particularly after I'd say like 2014, 2015 in New York City, and I was there as a grad student and just sort of taking it all in, and by kind of chance was offered to write or was commissioned to write a piece, a review of a show at Artist Space before it was in where it's at now. It was in this like smaller location show called Unholding in 2018, where I saw many of works by many of the artists who are in the show here at Rutgers, and for the first time. It was sort of my first encounter, like with the bag works of and Peter Jemison and Kay Walking Stick's works, and they were placed alongside contemporary artists like the New Red Order. So it really feels like this kind of prescient moment to then see, and this was a small show, right? So to see those kinds of artists now in this much bigger scale, and obviously not just specific to people who've passed through New York City, but to see that kind of minor explosion and really keep radiating out is really is both exciting and I think it is a moment for reflection on sort of how we got there and where we're going. One of my favorite pieces that I saw in the show is actually the one that's circulating a lot with the materials. It's that picture of a burr by Peter Jemison, called Red Power Sandburr, I believe, right, from 73. One of the reasons that I was drawn to it is, because that year is so powerful, as he names, 1973, thinking about it, the Red Power movement. But because of that reference to movement and my encounter with him in the city, it just really brought to the forefront of my mind of how movements, both artistic movements, political movements, and social movements, are created through movement, through the movement of people, right? Through people either being forcibly or by their own agentive desires, moving from where they are to where other people are, coming together, this kind of convening, right? And that's what the city has always been, a place that people move to or move through to meet, to encounter, right? To exchange. And that was what happened in places like San Francisco, in the Bay Area, right, in the occupation of Alcatraz, and it's what happens in New York City through artists and writers and intellectuals, right, and people who come together from all these different places and move together in ways that create these really powerful movements. So the city, even though we have this idea of the urban Indian, right, and the city as this really kind of specific space for Indigenous people, Native people, it's not isolated. It exists in the network with what we think of as Indian country, which is to say, right, that not only is New York City always been Indian country and people sort of remake it as Indian country with every generation, but that it also exists in connection in a circuit to reservations and more rural or less resourced places. And I think that Jaune Quick-to-See Smith is somebody who lived those kind of connections and that kind of circuit, right? Somebody who was involved with so many of the kind of places that you named, right? Santa Fe, the Institute for American Indian Arts, but also with founding with Peter the art gallery at the American Indian Community House in the late 70s. And maybe I'll go to that image now. So actually, just the other week, I was teaching my Intro to Native American and Indigenous Studies class, and we do a week on Native New York, and this was the picture I was showing them when talking about the history of the American Indian Community House. And you can see Jaune in the back row there, maybe 3 people from the right. I'm sorry, I'm like terrible with orientations. Yeah. Yes. And just she's radiating, everybody in this photo is just like radiating this kind of like joy and energy that is still incredibly like moving, thinking again of like movement, it's like you could tell that they were all engaged in collaborative activity with each other that was incredibly meaningful, right? We were trying to kind of identify everyone earlier. There's some members of the Spider Woman Theater and other artists that you might recognize and that are in the show. So yeah, this is taken outside of the American Indian Community House, where Jaune and Peter had founded this gallery. So I was, of course, familiar with Jaune before I ever met her, which was actually not so long ago. But it's her that, it's because of her that I'm involved in this exhibit at all. And it's really because of her that I've sort of continued to try to stay in touch with artists and with my art writing practice, because she really illuminated to me how kind of important those practices are and those relationships are. But I don't know, maybe this is indulgent, but I just was going back through our emails, and the first email I ever got from her was like, I literally thought I was like being punked. It was just 4 years ago, I guess, August 2nd, 2021, I got this email. Hi Lou, I'm a fan of your writing and as such would like to know if you might have time to join a group of natives in a writing project. Your essay might be 6,000 words? ? Not sure. If you might be interested, please let me know and we can talk further. Be well, Jaune. I had never heard from her before. So, we'd never met, and so to get this email out of the blue that had already this kind of warmth and just generosity and openness that I'm sure anybody who's met Jaune in the room is familiar with, just really took me aback, and I think I probably had to close it and just be like, is this real? And yeah, that was the beginning of our kind of collaboration, writing about her show at the Whitney, working on this catalog and potentially another in publication. But just, yeah, to get that kind of affirmation from, somebody who's such a powerhouse was really, it's hard to even state sort of how meaningful that was for me. But yeah, what I've always really appreciated about Jaune, and I'll conclude here, is, many things, but particularly her political and worldly vision. She's one of these people who just thought about everything. There was really kind of no place or struggle that she didn't alight upon, whether it's about labor, gender, colonialism, imperialism, like she would bring it all together. And I'm thinking especially of her maps, which I teach all the time, and how they really train you to see the world in this just like other way, right? And always with Native resistance and presence at the center. The other thing I really appreciate about Jaune is, how she reached out to me and how she reached out to so many people kind of who she saw coming up behind and after her, right? And really tried to raise up the next generation of artists and critics and thinkers and writers in ways that continue to really reverberate. And it stuck out to me reading the kind of intro text, right? This idea that she was laying out about how for so long Native people have been described as vanishing or kind of otherwise invisibilized, and she really wanted us, she wanted Native people and Native artists to have recognition, but I really appreciate the way that she specified that recognition. She said recognition from each other and from the public, right? She wasn't saying we need recognition from wealthy institutions or from wealthy collectors or from the market, right? Which are all considerations that do at some point come into play in the careers of artists, right? But that idea of recognition from each other and from the public, right? From the people that we do things with, that we move with, that's who we want to see what we're capable of and to believe, right, in that collective capacity. So that kind of recognition, I think, is really important to hold on to and distinguish from, right, what might be kind of conventional forms of recognition and success. And in recognizing each other, we recognize that history and recognize what could still be based on these images of what has been. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you both for your wonderful discussions. Those were amazing. Thank you. So, to the audience, first we're going to do a little discussion panel, and then we'll open up to questions from you guys. But first, I think I wanted to talk about, Lou, you kind of touched on this, but there's a growing presence of a Native American art community in New York City, right? And I'm wondering, from both of you, how have you seen sort of the explosion of that over the last 10 years or so? Like, what has that trajectory been?
Well, I think New York City is and will continue to be sort of the creative center of the arts within North America. So it's a place that people gravitate toward for career building. But I loved what you shared, Lou, regarding how Jaune understood the public. And that idea that we are all relatives, that we are in a relationship. And so that's the feeling I have that is so unlike New York City. That the Native artists who come there experience the city, but they experience the city at a deeper level. And that level is about being in a relationship with fellow artists.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to really describe because there's been multiple trajectories, right? And there's so many art worlds that kind of exist, sometimes in tension with each other, sometimes in collaboration, right? Sometimes not knowing anything about each other. And so there are these multiplicity of native art worlds as well in the city, and indigenous art worlds. So it's kind of hard to track any one, but this last week when I did that unit on Native New York, one of the kinds of suggestions to my students was over this long weekend we had to go out to different kind of cultural sites in the city. And some of them were like the big ones you'd expect, the National Museum of the American Indian, of course, right? And the idea was these were all places they could see native art. There's the Met now has the collection there. The National Museum of Natural History, or the American Museum of Natural History has tried to kind of rework their collection of Pacific Northwest arts and material culture that they kind of have on display. But then I also was like, I'm just going to look around at different galleries and see if there are any native artists showing. And there, it's like within a 10-minute walk from my apartment in West Village, you could be seeing native artists. And I don't know if that would have been as true 10 years ago, right? That it's like every month, any kind of little gallery in Soho or Chelsea, right? There's a chance to see if it's the work of Natalie Ball or Raven Chacon, all of these people who may not always live in the city, but whose work circulates through there. And I was kind of taken aback by just that kind of proliferation and almost saturation. And again, the range of it from these kinds of obscure galleries where my student was like, I went there and I wasn't sure how to get in, because you're like buzzing up and going in some weird elevator, to students being like, yeah, I found the dark room of the cradle board at the Met, because you do have to kind of search it out. But just that range, I think, does reflect several of the trajectories that Native art has taken. A place like the city with this interest by major institutions and a kind of uneasy, maybe, incorporation or accommodation, some on larger scales than others, and then what it's always been, people grinding and trying to get work out and get it shown to the public, but also their friends, and make things happen in that way.
Sort of a follow-up to that question is, how can we as individuals or people who work within larger institutions continue to foster that sense of community within this area?
Food.
Oh,
yeah. I have a story to tell about Jaune. It's not on the topic, but I'm just remembering it. In 1983, I was showing at Elaine Horwich Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I went out to a pueblo to one of the dances. I had an old Peugeot, a diesel Peugeot. I drove out to the pueblo for the dances. Dances finished. Got in my car, and someone had siphoned all the diesel. I'm in the middle of nowhere. I know no one except Elaine Horwich. I call Elaine Horwich and I say, I'm stranded. Can you send someone out here? Can you help me? I'm busy. We're busy in the gallery. I don't have time. The only other person I knew in all of New Mexico was Jaune Quick-to-See Smith. And she was down in Corrales. I called her and I said, Jaune, I need your help. What's up? Someone siphoned my diesel. I'll be right out. She came with a gas can. She saved my life. And I think, that was her personality. You mentioned how many different issues she stayed on top of. but she was really there to support and help and nurture fellow artists in a really profound and real way that we don't see often, and that this exhibit reflects that.
Yeah, no, Jaune was incredibly special. She just, I think, Lou, you touched on this, just her warmth about everything. She was just always, she treated everything with such care. And I think that's really reflected in this exhibition. And she really cared about community, her community. And, you know, the show is so intergenerational. So many family relationships are reflected in it, or other forms of kinship, or you know, student-teacher relationships. It's really amazing. So, Joe, I'm curious, how did you first become acquainted with Jaune?
I moved from Oklahoma to Phoenix, Arizona in 1981. Jaune Quick-to-See. Well, before that move, I was visiting faculty at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. There was an exhibition of her work at the Gardner Gallery on campus, and that was the first time I had seen her work. And it was the pastel drawings, the works on paper. It's like, wow, what is this? You know, it was really compelling. So I wanted to know more about her, and I reached out to her. And so after that move to the Southwest, I was in and out of Santa Fe a lot. I lived in Shiprock for a while. So we just became acquainted in that way.
Yeah, great.
We have a lot of stories about gallerists too.
The memoir.
A tell-all.
So Lou, you wrote an essay for the catalog, which is coming out in May, about Indigenous futurisms. And I'm curious if you could talk more about your process writing that essay, or just sort of general thoughts on Native futurism and the discussions around it currently.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great question. I never remember how anything I write gets written. It's a chaotic thing, but I actually am working on a piece right now called Reconsidering Indigenous Futurism, which is, the title is taken by a similar essay by Kodwo Shun, Reconsidering Afrofuturism, or Reconsiderations of Afrofuturism. I might be messing it a little bit. But just to think about kind of where are we at in terms of Indigenous futurisms, like circulation in both art, culture, society, politics, I guess. There was that big moment of Indigenous futurism, particularly around like 2012 and onwards. And I think there's sort of a more general sense now, perhaps, of just like futurity and a future, right? And of an emphasis on thinking different futures to the doom and gloom of many of our current timelines. But yeah, I've just been kind of thinking about what was that moment. Has it passed? I think it was really animated in part by Indigenous social and political movements at the time that were particularly thinking of different environmental futures. A alternative to fossil fuels, was a big kind of banner movement. It's maybe less kind of ever present on our minds, but that was a major motivator for thinking of what Indigenous practices have to say or intervene about in regards to how we build, our planetary as well as political and social futures. And so I'm wondering, how do those the urgency of that moment, where did it go? What kind of came of Indigenous futurism? Because my sense is that it exists in the art world, but I don't know, the kind of energy around it is not as present. But it's the problem of also being a cultural historian, is you're trying to study things as they pass and come to be, and I'm just trying to get a grasp on it. So you asked me this question at a time when I'm asking myself that question a lot as well.
Yeah, that's writing, very fun, right? Great process. Joe, you have a piece in the exhibition, one of your bandolier bags, and I think there's a great story behind it, if you want to talk about it a bit.
Well, the bandolier bag that's in the exhibit here really resulted in the fact that growing up in Oklahoma, I had never seen a bandolier bag by the Lenape community. I had only seen photographs of those bags in books. So in the early 1990s, I had a residency at National Museum of the American Indian. That's before they moved the collection to DC. It was it was in the Bronx. In the collections area, I was looking at Lenape material, and I discovered a bandolier bag. This incredibly beautiful, powerful work of art. What I was not prepared for was the fact that I read the provenance, the collection history of this particular bag. It was collected from my community, Copan, Oklahoma, in 1920 by M.R. Harrington and brought here to New York. So that compelled me. I'd never made a bandolier bag. That I have to figure out how to do this, and I have to bring these bags home. And so I made the first bag, and I brought it back to the dances in the spring to Oklahoma, and people would come around to camp and look at the bag. Actually, one person said, "I'll be right back, I need to borrow the bag." They took it to a Xerox machine and Xeroxed it. And then the next year at the dances, there was another bag that someone else had made. So it really did have the impact of homecoming, of bringing the art, bringing this, these, not artifacts, I don't call them artifacts or objects, bringing the art home. And I shared with you, they're very time intensive to make. It takes a year to make a bag, at least. And every time I make a bag, I say, "That's it, it's my last bag." And then within a month, I'm on the next one.
That's a great story. I remember reading your artist statement and being very touched by it. It's a very powerful piece in the show, and I'm so happy that we have it.
Thank you.
Are there any projects you're working on with the Lenape Center at the moment?
Well, this is really interesting. We just installed an exhibition at Gracie Mansion. I mean, imagine that. That we actually, it's an intervention in city government by bringing Lenape art to Gracie Mansion. And let me just say this, it doesn't go outside the room. But the Gracie Mansion Conservancy said, you better get this exhibit in by the end of the month. And I said, uh-oh, something, you know, because there's a lot of controversy regarding the current mayor of the city of New York. So we have the work installed, and hopefully it's going to be there. I mean, in the seat of government. I love that. I love that energy and power of the arts, that it really can be an activist statement, really can sort of cause trouble.
When does it open?
It's up. I mean, to get into Gracie Mansion, you know, it's like you got to go through the police. You know, it's a big deal to get in there. I think you should call the mayor's office and ask for a tour.
Yes.
Lou, are there any other projects that you're working on? You mentioned this essay that you're working on. Are there any other things on your horizon?
Well, yeah, I'm writing a bunch of stuff, kind of all the time, I guess. But I'm focusing right now. I'm working on an article on the poetry of Lee Miracle, and I'm working on a book project, which is about lunar colonization. And there are some art works mentioned therein. One of my favorite moon pieces recently that was new to me was Shelley Nero's photo of the moon. I think it's called The Moon Post-Industrial Pre-Colonial. And it's just this amazing print of a photo of the moon she took.
So today, before the discussion, we walked around the galleries a little bit, and I'm wondering if there were any pieces that you were particularly excited about, or artists you were excited to see in the show?
Well, I'm excited about Bentley Spang and what's upcoming for people who are here in this community. The powwow piece, which opens Techno Powwow by Bentley Spang, which opens October 13th here on campus. And you're going to see me out there dancing. It's going to be great. And, you know, it's like, for me, seeing this exhibit, being in the galleries, it's sort of like family, because many of these artists, Pete Jemison, Bentley Spang, I mean, so many of them, I mean, really early ones, and then even later ones, I have interactions with. So it's kind of like, you know, there's that familial feeling. Like, and then the other connection is the kids.
Yeah.
I mean, the next generation of you know, in these families, it continues. That was a great discovery.
Sorry, I was just pulling up some of the photos I took, about a couple hours ago, because there were new artists to me, and that in itself is, you know, exciting to have an encounter with somebody whose work you haven't come across, and that just like sort of immediately you feel kind of in some sort of tune with them. So one of the pieces for me like that was the Judith Lowry piece, the medicine. I mean, obviously it's like the scale of it kind of gets you first, but I really appreciate the sort of the commentary that's embedded in it, and the insistence on kind of critical commentary, right? And that there's a sort of self-criticism as well as external critique, which I think, right, is one, that art is one space to do that. And so I appreciate that piece. As I mentioned, I liked Peter Jemison's Sandburr Red Power, because like you, I'm also very interested in the histories of the Red Power movement and how it's sort of expressed in different realms. And then lastly, that installation, I guess you would call it, I was calling it a science experiment.
Lorenzo Clayton.
Lorenzo Clayton's. If you have a chance to spend some time with that, maybe you can puzzle out to me what these numbers are saying to you, what kind of beings they are. But yeah, that one kind of rewired my mind a little bit. So that's always a good experience on a gallery.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Lorenzo's piece, I'm going to be thinking about that for the whole year. It's a great piece. Should we open it up to audience Q&A? If anyone has any questions?
I'll get started and we'll pass around the mic. I wanted to go back to, the frame of the discussion, traditional contemporary. And Lou, I know you brought up the dyad, and I was really interested in thinking about diaspora, other dyads that are interesting. But I also am curious, I know we discussed on Zoom, but when we were planning for the talk, and maybe that frame is no longer useful. Is it as the way you think about Native American art, or how you think about the show, or maybe what does tradition mean and what does contemporary mean as a dyad? Or what are the frames that we can move through?
Well, from my perspective, tradition is forward. Tradition is movement. And so much of Western society wants to hold tradition fixed in time. And the other thing that really strikes me that we haven't discussed, maybe I have this problem of getting off topic.
Go right ahead.
But the idea that for Native people, the arts are a way of life, a way of living. So it becomes really how you move in the world, how you relate to people, how you are in relationship with the land, with the sky, with the water. This idea of painting and sculpture, is really a Western construct. It really has arrived here from Europe. I'm not saying anything critical of that. But for Native artists, I think you are required to navigate these two worlds and to reconcile those differences.
Yeah, there's something about how you're describing tradition, I think, movement, but also about being sort of just like close in relation maybe to the processes of creation. And that to me is like art and tradition are both sort of about that, or what we think of as tradition in terms of like ritual, protocol, right? Those are also about, I think, being close to the process of creation and collectivity, of constituting the collective and trying to reproduce the conditions of life, which is being close to the process of creation and sometimes of transformation, which is yet to me artistic practice is also about that, whether it's whatever form it takes, also writing, poetics, all of that. But as somebody who also grew up kind of outside of the traditions of the Dene, in like the sense of ritual, language, other kinds of traditions, I've also understood my indigeneity as part of a political tradition, right? Which is why I'm often more comfortable saying that I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation than I am saying that I'm Dene, even though both are true, Dene being, right, like the Navajo word for Navajo. And, it does to me speak to a status, that I am enrolled in this nation, and therefore the federal government of the United States, who has done all sorts of things to the Navajos, right, has certain responsibilities towards me and my people that I want to insist on. And so that's an important tradition for me, right, as a political tradition of knowing our status as distinct from the U.S. and carrying that forward into the future.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here and excited to see the show. My question has to do with Indigenous futurism and with dance. I'm curious, anytime we hear the term futurism, you know, in layman's term, we think of like sci-fi, that kind of thing. I'd love to know the connection, or maybe there's not a connection, in the indigenous frame, you know, of this term futurism and what it means. And also, I love your passion for dance, and I too am also passionate about dance. And wondering if you could just talk a little about what dance, how dance fits into this. Thank you.
Well, dance for me, I mean, what was part of the most cherished and spectacular moments of my childhood. It was for me the opportunity to be in the dance arena and to move with the drum. And you know, later in my life became running, because I had the same kind of relationship with running that I had with dance. So there's a moment, as a kid I was a fancy dancer and I danced competitively, but there's a time in your movement when you really are moving just above the ground. And your foot touches the ground, and you must keep that connection to earth, but you're really flying. And you know, I still have dreams about those moments when I was a kid, and I could move at that speed. It's very freeing, it's very beautiful, and it's very spiritual. And it was also fun to be in the dance arena with the elders, because they would correct you. You know, they were like the final say, and you're doing this right or you're doing this wrong. And you sought to please them. So that's how I feel about dance.
Yeah, in terms of Indigenous futurism, certainly a lot of influence and exchange with science fiction and engagement with science fiction and kind of rewriting of science fiction narratives. I'll say that I sort of first got interested in what came to be called Indigenous futurism, you know, before it was sort of coined, which was in 2012. And that was from experiences at the Gallup Flea Market in Gallup, New Mexico, which is a reservation border town, where many people are selling their kinds of Danaized Star Wars merchandise, right? In fact, the first feature film to be dubbed entirely in the Navajo language was Star Wars. I think A New Hope, right? The first one? Yeah. Right, so there's like a joke, I think the 1491's made, that Star Wars is the Navajo creation story. So there's like, obviously something happened, you know, despite what I said about growing up outside the culture of my people, somehow I found my way there through science fiction. And that seems to be a kind of shared like meta text for understanding our place in the world and in the States and in the cosmos, right? That there's just something about those kinds of narratives that are appealing, again, for kind of intervention, right? As much as kind of simply like drawing on. And yeah, while there is this kind of like similar like morphology with Italian futurism, Russian futurism, really the kind of antecedent is Afrofuturism, right, which itself grows out of Black interest in science fiction, but also just the kind of intersection of technology, society, right, and culture. So even if it's not sort of directly science fiction, it's sometimes, you know, science fiction-y or futuristic. in the kinds of ideas and vocabularies that it draws on. But as I said, also there's a kind of other current that sort of took over that was sort of just more broadly about kind of imagining alternative futures that's not necessarily tied to like ideas of science fiction in particular, but that's certainly like the seed.
Manny Wheeler and his wife are the couple who translated Star Wars into Navajo. And Manny Wheeler was the installationalist, I can't say it, help me. He built the exhibits at the Hearn Museum in Phoenix. And he left that position to go to Window Rock to be the director of the Navajo Nation Museum. But he and his wife are the ones who did that. So, you know, you never know what's in these museum systems, right? Who's working and what they're up to, right? It's great. It's a wonderful, the museum profession is a wonderful place to be because it gives you permission and room to be yourself.
Any other questions?
A little bit of a narrow question, but you mentioned the Lenape Gallery in New York. Can you just tell us a little bit about it? Is it open to the public or whatnot?
The exhibit that I mentioned is currently up for review at the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Art, 91st and 5th Avenue. It's the Smithsonian Design Museum. And the title of the exhibit is Making Home. Lenape Center's installation is the Welcome to Territory, the first exhibit that you encounter as you enter the museum. It features 3 turkey feather capes that I constructed along with the wallpaper design, which plays upon the tulip poplar trees in Inwood Hill Park. The exhibit is really an exciting exhibit of 25 different commissioned installations by artists from the U.S. territories, and tribal nations. It's up through September.
It's in Inwood Park?
No, it's 91st Street and 5th Avenue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for putting on both the exhibit and this program. You know, I'm a professor here at Rutgers, and the field of anything we might call settler colonial studies or indigenous studies is under attack around the country. So this is really great to be here and gain some strength also in being together. In thinking about indigenous futurism, I can't help but think about indigenous endings, given that we're living through a genocide of an indigenous people right now, Palestinians in Gaza. And of course, as we know, Palestinian art has also been a huge vessel of insistence, resistance, return, right? And this idea of the indigenous diaspora really had me thinking about ways of connecting to different legal regimes, international law, all of those things. But my question is, and I know we have some of our students here, what advice can you give to, you know, particularly younger students who are being assaulted in all these ways and whose existence themselves is just being rejected? Since we have you here as elders, what advice can you give us to have a future?
None of us are safe in the current political reality that we are living. I, for one, feel like I'm pelted by rocks every day. I wake up to a new, horrific announcement. as adjunct faculty on campus last semester at Columbia University, I was horrified to witness the actions upon campus. I don't know where we go. I don't think any of us do. There's this time of great uncertainty. What I do know is that we Lenape survived a genocide. First with the arrival of the Dutch in 1609 upon these shores, then by the British, and then the US government. And so those 25 families, about 900 persons who survived all the forced removals to Indian Territory in 1857, somehow had the courage and the strength and the ingenuity, and I believe the creativity to outwit those who were chasing them. And so I think we will find within us that inner strength, but we have to support one another. We have to be a community. The universities are threatened in ways that they have never experienced before. And from my perspective, they have an ethical and a moral responsibility to provide a safe environment for their students, whatever the cost.
Was not expecting that question for advice, but the thing about recognition that I was ending on is something I've been thinking about in terms of in these moments of acute danger and uncertainty. It's so important to recognize like who your people are and also what that danger is, right? And as you're saying, right, to acknowledge its scale and scope, and that nobody is really left untouched by what has been kind of culminating in this country and in the world. And that somebody told me once about teaching that, it's really hard to know what you're going to say that will stick with somebody, that will kind of worm into their consciousness, but really all we can do is kind of give people the ability, or at least the maybe not the ability to see everything, to try to see more clearly, and so that in that moment of acute danger, our students and ourselves might be able to act through courage instead of fear. And that's always stuck with me, because I don't necessarily think of myself as a very brave person, but I do think of myself as a teacher, and I do think that anything that I've ever done that has been courageous has been moved by a sort of grounding and knowledge of what the situation called for and what was called for in me. And so it's also about recognizing your place and your power, and that no one person has to be a hero, right? But you can, in a specific moment, act through courage instead of fear, and that can make all the difference, even if it's a very small moment, seemingly.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for your wonderful questions, and thank you both for your participation tonight. It was wonderful. I just want to point out some other events we have coming up. So we have the continuation of our virtual artist talk series. Our next talk will be with Tyrell Tapaha on April 14th, followed by Michael Naminka in May and Kara Romero in June. In the fall, we'll be having more in-person events, including the Techno Powwow that Joe discussed, and we'll have him back with us. And then there's also a performance by Laura Ortman in November. She's doing an original piece for the exhibition. And you can check out our website for more details. So thank you all for coming tonight, and take care.